So, we just came out of a conversation, polling, politics, policy. Just one thought I had from the beginning of that conversation going into this one is I think sometimes we fall into the false paradigm of it's all about a bureaucracy or a government answer, or it's all about the bootstraps and it's the individual on their own. And, a lot of times I think we try to do in our policy work, how are you creating the right conditions? How are you being really respectful and relevant with your services and your strategies and your policies? But then how are you lifting up families and their strength and their resilience? And so just kind of bringing that lens into the room I think is important. I also, when we think about polling and sort of how do elected leaders step up, sometimes I go very old-fashioned. I still think there's something to be said for doing the right thing because it's the right thing. I don't think that is lost, and I don't think we should give up on that. I've actually, when I've been out in communities speaking, like Ralph, like literally hundreds of communities, I have not had a problem getting different and diverse elected leaders engaged. Part of it is how do you stay focused, how do you stay connected, and how do you really be about doing the right thing for the right reason at the right time. So it's sort of with that pleasure, or that backdrop, it's my pleasure to introduce Senator Martin Heinrich from the great state of New Mexico. We've had the pleasure of working together for almost about 2 years, really with your leadership and the leadership of Susan Collins to explore the conditions, the challenges, the traps affecting so many families stuck in low-income situations without opportunity. And working with you, I have to really call out your dedication, your intellectual curiosity, your analytical approach. I think that's the engineer in you. But also at the end and the beginning of the conversations, it's always about ultimately caring about the children and the families in your community. And I just think we need to recognize and hold that up. Senator Heinrich was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2012. Prior to that, he spent 2 years in the House. Prior to that, he worked at the Albuquerque City Council, where he was elected by his peers to serve as council president. He has been a extremely well-respected and pioneering leader, especially in the field of energy, environment, public lands, conservation, sustainable development. He serves on the committees of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources, Armed Services, Intelligence, and he's recently the ranking member of the Joint Economic Committee. Martin is sort of always thinking about, if you think about his committees, you understand the land of New Mexico, the federal labs, the public sector, the beauty. And he's really been sort of out there on those issues, as well as always thinking about the middle class with a strong track record on everything from gender pay equity, reduced student loans, minimum pay. And so I just, raising the minimum wage level at the federal level. So he's been out there a lot of his core issues. And over the past couple of years, we've been sort of worked gently with him under, again, his leadership to really think about what's happening for those that are the most vulnerable families facing the toughest challenges. And then he's also done it very much with an equity lens. When we think of like a state at New Mexico that is majority-minority, minority-majority, it has 23 tribal nations. You have 19 pueblos. You have 3 Apache tribes, Mescalero, Jicarilla, and Fort Sills, and you have the Navajo Nation. And so I think he's always going to be looking at the lens through equity, inclusion, intersectionality. And that's, I think, a very powerful piece, and also connecting it to rural. With all of that said, that's just a little bit of who he is. I will give a shout out to the folks at Central New Mexico Community College, Kathy Winograd, president of CNM, who's also an Aspen Institute Ascend Fellow. They enroll 29,000 students per year with a 95% job employment rate in the related field. Sounds like they're doing something right there. One of her big goals also is to make CNM a family-friendly, family-welcoming campus for students who are working, who are parents, or for next generation. So I know they'd be shouting out to you, Senator Heinrich, in their support, and it's only because they're back home working away. So sort of laying all of this out, as someone who was really first, a lot of your early work was on environment and the economy. Tell us about your journey to think about children, families, and breaking the cycle of poverty.
Well, let me start and just thank Ascend and also Susan Collins for none of this is possible without partnership, and certainly in the Senate, very little moves forward if it's not bipartisan as well. But a lot of my early work was focused on energy. I'm an engineer by training, a lot of Department of Defense work as well. But when you travel around a state like New Mexico, we have deep structural problems and a substantial amount of poverty and real struggles in rural areas, in urban areas. Having worked in places like the Navajo Nation, where I saw firsthand when I was out in the Thoreau area, people still haul water to and from their homes, don't have indoor plumbing or a well or a water supply, sometimes don't have electricity. The poverty stares you in the face. And I had sort of racked my brain for a long time about what we needed to do that was different, how we could take sort of a 21st century approach to making sure that the young people I meet in the state could meet their potential. And time and again, as I started looking at this sort of two-generation approach popped out, I think part of it was the context that even before the most recent election, it was very clear that under the budget pressures we were under, there wasn't going to be some giant new infusion of public resources into a new program on poverty. So what could we do? And the idea of being able to take what we have but make it work better, I saw the potential for a real bipartisan attraction there, and to give people the support they need as a whole of family is something that really resonates in New Mexico. I mean, family is sort of the first value that I would articulate when someone would ask me about my home state. And so as I learned more and more about this sort of approach, it just made intuitive sense. I thought it was something that could catch on in the current, very challenging and polarized environment. And I wanted to do something meaningful and concrete and pragmatic around the kind of poverty that some of us struggle with in our home states.
Really appreciate that. And I wonder, I don't know if everybody sort of had a chance to read the Two-Generation Economic Empowerment Act yet. It was recently dropped, but for those of you that have not had a chance to see it, I'd love for you to just share a little bit about the content of the bill and what do you think is especially most promising in today's climate?
There's three basic parts to the bill. I think the first part is something that probably should have happened a long time ago, but it was good to put it in the bill and say this is something we should absolutely be doing, is taking the federal family of agencies and making them sit at the same table in a sort of intergenerational committee to address these issues and stop allowing them to be siloed in their separate agencies. Looking at how we can better seam those things together and make them accessible to people working across all of those agencies. So that council is a central part to the legislation. And then looking at encouraging, whether it's a city or a county or a tribe or a state, to be able to take different funding sources and seam those together and try to create that whole of family approach with real oversight, but also incentives, like not having a different report to every agency that you might be able to bring funding in. Have one report to all of those agencies that deals with each of their focuses. So that I think is a part of the legislation that has real opportunity to make a difference. I think there are a lot of, whether it's an educational entity like CNM that you mentioned, whether it's a local nonprofit. I got to see what United Way of Santa Fe is doing with this kind of approach, whether it's a county that sees this problem and wants to take a more creative approach. I think that's a very important part of the legislation. And then we have a pilot project for social impact bonding, which is one of the more innovative approaches out of there that we're just beginning to see the results from, and is on sort of the cutting edge. And I think it's structured in such a way that these three separate pieces are all there and they're complementary, but if there are opportunities to move one or another, it's very easy to sort of separate out the parts as well.
That's really helpful. And one of the things I'm curious about, I want to pull out, because when we were working on sort of beginning the conversations around the content of this work, it was very important to Senator Heinrich and obviously to the Aspen Institute that how this is sort of launched in a very bipartisan way. And, as I mentioned earlier, we're active in about 45 states at a practice and or policy or both way, and also with families and communities and local philanthropy. And it was really powerful when we talked to a lot of offices where they had action happening, but were supportive, but didn't necessarily, the first person didn't say yes, and I think he'll be one of our best supporters later. But when we had the conversation, well, you did, and I followed up months later, but with Senator Susan Collins, I wanted to bring, she could not be here because she both has a sprained ankle and couldn't leave the Hill. He happens to be a marathon runner, and he's great, so he's here. But I really, she felt very badly about not being here in person and actually sent a letter. And I think she's someone, when I look at who on the Republican side is really kind of committed to bipartisanship, doing the right thing, she wrote a letter, and I just wanted to read part of it. I asked her, she asked me to read just part of it for you, her voice could be here in the room. And so in her letter, she says, "It's time for a new approach. I appreciate the Institute's support for the bipartisan Two-Generation Economic Empowerment Act I authored with Senator Martin Heinrich, which would address the gap between our good intentions as a society and the ineffective results. Our bill would equip parents and their children with the tools they need to succeed, better coordinate efforts across government agencies, and encourage public-private partnerships to harness the power of philanthropy. Our bill makes an important step towards reevaluating our approach to poverty-reducing programs and promoting innovative, most effective use of dollars to lift families out of poverty." That's just at the heart of her message. She's someone who has a slightly sort of older population state. She has a high rural state. She has a rural impact 2-gen R&D site that I believe she has visited. She's sort of personally been committed on this journey, and also has an educare site and thinking a lot about early learning and investing in people. And when we think about all the conversations that are happening, Senator Heinrich, I'm sort of curious how, what have the conversations been like for you and Senator Collins, and how do you see sort of moving this conversation, both moving this bill, but also more broadly moving the minds and discourse and commitment across the U.S. Senate, which is so important right now?
Well, it was interesting. I was not surprised that Senator Collins agreed to co-sponsor this legislation, because as demographically different as our states are, on a lot of other levels, they're very similar. They're very rural. There are real structural challenges to creating sustainable economies in those rural areas. And she's very pragmatic. She wants to get things done. She doesn't just want to message about things like some of our colleagues, focus on. So it was really a good partnership from the start. We had been able to work together on some other things. We share some committees, and I think it was a very good fit. I think our work going forward cut out for us is going to be to look at the Health Committee in particular and to tell these stories about why this is effective. And you notice that word effective was even in her letter. And that is a very attractive word for those members who want to get things done, and to have data-driven, effective programs that, in this environment aren't going to be bringing necessarily new federal resources to the table, but can produce results both for, the children and their families, but also for society as a whole. I mean, one of the things that always bothers me is to look at a child who has so much potential and realize, because of whatever zip code they're growing up in, that they're probably not going to meet that potential. And the gap between those two things gets born as a cost for all of us. And we see it show up in a myriad of different ways, whether it's the level of opiate addiction that we see in our country right now, the prison population and its size, recidivism, et cetera. Like, so many of those things need to be headed off when that child is 5 years old and really excited about their Head Start classes, or going into kindergarten, and having parents who are modeling the right things, who are trying to go to school and better themselves, and don't have some of the behaviors that then lead to those things being repeated over and over again. So I think we're going to need to tell the success stories, and many of you are familiar, you bring those stories from all around the country, because there are places where people are doing this now. And I think to take the stories that Senator Collins has from Maine, that I have from New Mexico, and I want to encourage all of you to leave your stories in the story booth while you're here, because frankly, that helps us take those things to our colleagues and say, hey, there's a better way to do this. And I really think, given the folks that are on the HELP committee, that we ought to be able to really add substantial bipartisan support to this effort.
That's great. And I'm sort of wondering, how do you see, I wonder, this has got to be sort of a thought question above everybody's head, thinking about the content of the two-generation Economic Empowerment Act, but then also some of the broader conversations that are happening around Medicaid, sort of responsibility between federal and state government and communities. How, sort of what are both your cautions or opportunities or key ways we should be thinking and or acting and being helpful?
I think first and foremost is telling the success stories from those nonprofits or those places around the country where this is working. That is first and foremost. And then I think also being a voice of caution that other things that we may do between now and when we're able to pass this legislation don't allow us to backslide. Making sure that people understand that a whole of family approach means that we have to make sure that basic things are there, including healthcare, obviously. And so that's also a place where I think voices from places where things are working, engaging governors who are making these things work in Republican and Democratic, red and blue states across the country, engaging other voices that will be received well across the political spectrum who are now bought into this idea and want to share it with policymakers at the federal level. Those are the kinds of things that I would point to.
Thank you. So I'm going to tee up, if people have questions, I have sort of two questions I'm going to ask together and let you answer them as you like, and then invite people to introduce themselves and ask a question of the senator if they would like. So we're trying to think a lot about what are new alliances of people in sort of leadership positions to help do the right thing. And there's so much activity at the federal level or at the national level. Policy really starts to play out in, life choices at the state level and at the community level. And so I sort of anticipate there's a lot of innovation and sort of effective implementation happening in the states that are using the two-gen approach as a strategy. And I'm wondering just whether there's any kind of opportunity to have a bipartisan group of senators and maybe bipartisan governors that could maybe form some kind of working group, because, we got to have outcomes guide this, but you also have to have enough resources to be effective as well as use them well. And so I'm just sort of wondering, what are your thoughts? I'm just trying to think out of the box about different ways to organize leadership, whether, kind of a group of governors and senators and maybe even House members might want to come together in some way.
I think it would be helpful to hear from governors, particularly what is working in the workforce lane around the country, because you can't do effective workforce training if you don't have many of the other things in place that support the family. If somebody can't, answer the child care question, they're not going to get the training that they need or the education that they need to get on that path to creating an effective workforce. And most governors realized without the workforce, you're not going to attract the kind of economic investment that you want to see in your state. So I think having that conversation in particular would be a real opportunity.
That's great advice. And then last one was on infrastructure. So infrastructure, and the Democrats, I've not had a chance to read the $1 trillion Democratic plan, but it seems like just the shift, and we are very lucky to have Nobel laureate Dr. James Heckman tomorrow, who one of his fundamental points is human development is economic development, and investing early is going to pay off later. Good, just kind of common sense stuff. In the infrastructure plan with the Democrats and just big picture, is there a real kind of big dosage on early learning and on people and on childcare and on facilities? And if not, can we put that in there?
I think that's a very effective ask. I mean, it is largely focused on sort of bricks and mortar, but also with a focus as well on what does infrastructure mean in the 21st century, and that means things like broadband, so that you can get services, healthcare, education, other services in through medicine and teletraining into rural communities, into places that otherwise wouldn't be able to access those things, to make sure that business development can happen in anywhere in the country, and a heavy dose of also realizing that we haven't really invested in our infrastructure on the energy side of things as well, and sort of updating what does infrastructure mean today as opposed to if it was the 1930s and we were just talking about roads and bridges.
Thank you. Questions in the audience?
That you're doing, and many of the problems that we have in terms of some of what we call the silos and the stovepipes, et cetera, in the federal government really have to do with what's in law. Mm-hmm. And eligibility criteria that's different and recertification criteria that's different in these laws. And I wonder if there's any thought given to right now to trying to tackle that issue, especially in the social programs. Because, we've been faced with, can we do a better job with the overlap? And I know that GAO has given you guys a number of reports on this, but the overlap is really secondary to the issues of being able to align these programs in a more reasonable way. And that gets back to the authorizing language that you guys give us or give the government, and making sure that there's some flexibility in the various agencies to align these things without being up against, violation of law.
And I think as we go down this road, I think we need to look for ways where you can meet the authorizing language outside of what has traditionally been required with a pathway for accountability and a certain amount of proving things work. So if you're able to hit certain goals, then you can have a waiver to what would normally be the authorizing requirements. And I think we need to build that into the way that we approach legislation and organizing these cross-jurisdictional programs.
Yoli Flores with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. There is so much evidence around so much of what we've been talking about, and Ralph in the previous panel talked about going beyond framing, and really helping legislators see in action great programs, bright spots, evidence-based. But even when we do, there seems to somehow always be a counter, whether it's refuting the data around gains for children that are in good quality early ed programs, learning programs. You'll get something about the fade out, right? So what What might you share with us about what else the field needs to do to persuade, encourage, teach our legislators that what we've been talking about for so long that you get, but so many of your colleagues on both the House and the Senate still do not, especially around early learning?
Yeah.
What is your best advice?
I think it's a combination of a compelling individual story oftentimes, and preferably one from someplace they can't ignore. So if it's from their own district or their own state, that makes it more compelling to them. Certainly they want to see their home team succeed, combined with data that comes from a source that is hard to refute, and an understanding that you have a continuum here, and you can't do the first three things and then just give up and expect the data at the end of 10 steps to be good. You really have to carry the ball and hand it off from step 1 all the way to step 10 with a continuum. And that's what we can do a whole lot better without really adding a lot of new resources, except for some willing partners in the private sector and the nonprofit sector and other places that haven't necessarily been fully utilized in the past.
Other questions? Because well, one question I wanted to add, and we talked about this earlier, and it's I think at the heart of how you work, and we've talked about it as a core principle around 2Gen, is the importance of public-private partnerships. And you have especially some very well-respected, fantastic foundations in the room. I'd give a little shout out to my friends over at the Kellogg Foundation who have really made New Mexico.
That's right.
I got to do it.
Thank you. I'm glad you're doing that.
But there's a lot of foundations here. The Kids Count with the Annie Casey Foundation is a fantastic resource, and many others here. But what are your thoughts around really leveraging public-private partnerships, whether it's at home state or nationally? And also, how do we get business and employers to really come to the table and incentivize that? So I'd sort of be curious, both employers and philanthropy, if you have thoughts about ways they can be more helpful or in this conversation.
I think with employers in the private sector, it's really good to engage them in the entire workforce conversation, which is very obvious to them in many cases what their challenges are, and use that as an introduction to the sort of whole of family approach that works, and then create with them, make them the advocates then for having this approach that starts with early childhood education and goes all the way through to making sure that these parents are in a position to succeed so that their kids can succeed. I think with the foundation world, I think it's really important to have a long-term commitment, and for foundations to understand that, if their focus changes every 3 or 5 years, we're not going to get the kind of results that you get when you make a decade or multi-decades long commitment that shifts in priority over time because of the data that you're getting back. But that there's this long-term partnership where the partners know that if they're making progress, they're going to continue to have the kind of support that they need to continue that progress.
That's great. All righty. Well, I think you've raised some really great points and requests of us in terms of how are we sharing up stories and solutions and connecting to the ground. And I think, how we can think more, and perhaps there might be some doors opening, and I'm expecting to hear from our next panel a little bit on maybe this infrastructure and other strategies about where we can be helpful in pushing in this moment. But, Senator Heinrich, you aptly raised, if we're not in it for the long haul, then these are not simple solutions. We're talking about bringing things together. We're talking, but bringing it through the lens of really the experience of a child and a family versus them fitting into the system. And that's really kind of turning the equation inside out. So I just, as you sort of I want to give you the last word, but I think you're aptly pushing on the workforce lever. We now are seeing the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act in implementation level. And one of the core pieces is childcare, early learning, or also different sectors like caregiving
Right.
that we could bump up and professionalize. So thinking about that. And then going into your new role with the Joint Economic Committee, and we do have a Nobel laureate economist tomorrow, and if we can get you his information, we'd be happy to, but showing the ROI. But as we think about how we're telling the story even of our economics, because we've had, when we think about 2010, unemployment 10%, 4.7,
Yep.
Household income way up, but yet, I'm getting the hook. Okay, got to let them go back and vote for good things, or for good issues. But we need to also track workforce participation more.
Absolutely.
And so I'm just sort of wondering, that doesn't come out with the monthly job numbers.
Yep.
So just I'll hush, but last words on from you.
I think the last thing I would say is, well, I'm actually in my role on the Joint Economic Committee as ranking member. One of the things we're looking at is the measures that we were not doing a very good job in looking at over the course of, say, 2009 until this year. It's really important that GDP goes up and that we see indicators like various index funds going up. But if people don't feel like they can retire with some level of security, if they don't feel like they're on a solid financial footing, that their kids are going to be able to go to college or at least get the workforce training they need to have a better job than they had, then we're not doing what we need to do. And having those sorts of measurements as well, I think, are a very important part of having an economy that works for all Americans.
Thank you very much, Senator Heinrich, and everybody please join me in thanking Senator Martin Heinrich for his leadership.